At 23 minutes past 10, on a Friday night in October, in the rain, at the edge of a small county airport in Middle Georgia, a sheriff closed a pair of handcuffs around the wrists of a 60-year-old woman. She had told him her name 3 times. He had not written it down once. "You don't get to walk into my county and open a runway because you say so," he told her. She did not raise her voice. In 30 years, almost nobody had ever heard her raise her voice. "My name is Evelyn Carter," she said. "You have less than 20 minutes to reconsider what you're doing." Sheriff Daniel Holt laughed. 20 feet behind him, on the other side of a wall of rain-streaked glass, a red telephone began to ring inside the control room. It was a phone the airport tested twice a year and had never once used for a live call. Airport manager Mara Jennings picked it up. She listened for 5 seconds. Then she looked out through the glass at the woman standing in the rain with her hands behind her back and the color drained out of her face. She covered the receiver. "Sheriff, the White House military office is on the line." Holt waved a hand at her without turning around. "They want to know why Evelyn Carter is in handcuffs." For the first time that night, Daniel Holt stopped smiling. 3 hours earlier, Evelyn Carter had been sitting alone in the back row of a small Baptist church outside Macon. No cameras, no motorcade on the grass, no reporters along the road with their collars turned up against the weather. That had taken 2 phone calls and 1 mild argument to arrange. For nearly 4 years, Evelyn had held one of the most powerful offices in Washington. At 60, she served as chief of staff to President Helen Ward. Every person, every crisis, every decision that reached the Oval Office passed through her first, or it did not reach the Oval Office at all. Evelyn had spent most of her adult life learning a simple thing about power. It is rarely loud. More often, it is a quiet person standing near a door, deciding who gets to walk through it. That evening, she wanted none of it. She had come home to bury Dr. Samuel Bell, the man who taught her American history 43 years earlier at a high school that no longer graduated anybody. She had been 17 the afternoon she stayed after class to argue with him about the Constitution. "You don't believe half of what's in that textbook," Bell said, leaning back against the chalk tray. "I believe the words," she told him. "I'm not always sure the country does." Bell smiled the way that made a teenager feel she had been handed an assignment instead of a compliment. "Then spend your life making the country answer to the words." She had Yale, law school, a first job answering constituent mail for $11,000 a year, committee counsel, 2 administrations, a reputation earned slowly and defended fiercely for remembering every promise anybody made in a room, and eventually, the West Wing. In all those years, Samuel Bell never once asked her for anything. Once a year, a handwritten note arrived on plain white paper, and it always said some version of the same thing. "Keep the door open for somebody who has never been invited inside." That sentence had lived in the top drawer of Evelyn's desk through 3 offices and 2 presidential campaigns. When Lorraine Bell called to say her father had died at 88, Evelyn canceled everything she could cancel and asked the president for the evening. Helen Ward did not hesitate. "Go bury your teacher. Washington will survive 1 night without you." Washington survived for almost 3 hours. At 9:41, Evelyn was driving north through hard rain when the secure phone in the console began to vibrate. 2 words on the display. "Watch floor." She answered on the first buzz. "This is Carter." The voice belonged to Thomas Vail, the National Security Advisor, a man who had never in his life begun a phone call with hello. "Where are you?" "North of Macon." "Can you get airborne?" Evelyn turned down the radio. "What happened?" "Coordinated systems disruption hitting communications nodes along the Atlantic corridor." "We don't know yet whether it's hostile action, a cascading software failure, or one riding in on top of the other." "How serious?" There was a pause on the line. That pause told her more than anything he said next. Serious enough that the president is coming back tonight. Air Force One is already repositioning out of Fort Worth. The secure compartment at the alternate command site comes live at midnight, and she wants you in the room before she sits down with the chiefs. Evelyn looked at the navigation screen. The nearest major airport was better than 90 minutes away in this weather. Too far. What's the alternate? Mercer County Regional. You're 14 miles from it. Small civilian field outside a town called Bellwether. 8,000 feet of runway, federal emergency designation, one tower position on overnight staffing. The storm shut them down 2 hours ago, but the field can be activated. Who's meeting me? The advance element is stuck behind a wreck on the state route. State Patrol is trying to reach you. I don't have time for either one. That's why I'm calling. Operations is transmitting the activation order now, and I'm having them copy the county so nobody out there is surprised to see you. Evelyn checked the clock. 9:47. How long do I have? The aircraft may put down there briefly before continuing east. That made her sit fully upright. Say that again. I can't discuss it on this channel. Thomas. Another pause. The president wants you aboard. Understood. Evelyn, do not get stuck on the ground. She almost laughed. I've spent 30 years avoiding that. The line went dead. The rain got worse. Mercer County Regional sat on the edge of Bellwether, Georgia, a town of 11,000 people surrounded by pine woods, soybean fields, and back roads that seemed designed to disappear after dark. At night, the place looked nearly abandoned. One low brick terminal, 2 hangars and a maintenance shed, and beyond all of it, 8,000 feet of wet black runway running out into the dark. Mara Jennings had managed that airport for 9 years. At 53, she knew every crack in the pavement and every local official who took credit when the field made money and demanded an explanation when it didn't. She was finishing a fuel report when the federal activation notice came across the terminal. She read it once, then she read it again. Emergency federal priority. Runway 1836. To be prepared for immediate operations. Secure ground access required. Authorized federal principal inbound. Carter, Evelyn M. Her first thought was that somebody had made a mistake. Her second was that nobody uses that language by mistake. She called the shop line and told Cal Prine to bring the primary runway lights up out of storm protocol. She woke Ben Walsh in the tower, a man who had come to Mercer County specifically because nothing ever happened there. And finally, because the order said, secure ground access required. And she had one unarmed line attendant on shift. She called the sheriff's dispatch center. Sheriff Daniel Holt happened to be standing in that room when the call came in. That was the first piece of bad luck. Daniel Holt was 56 years old and had been sheriff for 17 years. He won his last election with 68% of the vote. He shook hands outside the high school stadium on Friday nights, remembered widows by name, sat in the third pew on Sundays, and drove to Macon to visit deputies in the hospital. He had built a career on one phrase, repeated so often that people stopped hearing what it meant. In Mercer County, everybody follows the same rules. It sounded fair, and Holt believed it was fair. But rules in Daniel Holt's hands had a way of going soft around people he respected and hard around people he did not. He did not consider himself prejudiced. Men like Holt almost never do. He would have pointed to the black deputies he had hired and the scholarship his department funded, and he would have told you honestly that he judged a man by his conduct and nothing else. Underneath all of that lived a quieter assumption he had never once been asked to defend. Some people look like authority. Some people look like a problem. And Daniel Holt had never stopped to ask who taught him the difference. When dispatch said the airport needed security support for a federal arrival, he did not send a unit. He drove out there himself. Evelyn Carter's sedan reached the locked access gate at 10:08. Evelyn Carter, federal priority arrival. White House operations transmitted authorization to this field about 15 minutes ago. Static. Then a man's voice. Stay in the vehicle. I need access to the terminal. Stay in the vehicle. She checked her watch. Who am I speaking with? Sheriff Holt. Evelyn had been spoken to sharply by senators, generals, ambassadors, 2 governors, and once by a European prime minister who apologized before breakfast the next morning. She had learned not to confuse volume with strength, so she waited. 30 seconds later, a cruiser rolled out from beside the terminal and stopped on the far side of the gate. Daniel Holt stepped out, pulling a rain jacket over his uniform shirt, and walked toward her slowly. Evelyn noticed where his right hand settled. Not on his weapon, near it. That distinction mattered. So did the fact that she had seen the gesture before, in other parking lots, in other decades, at other hours of the night. He stopped under the security light. License and registration. Sheriff, this is not a traffic stop. I am the federal principal named in your airport's activation order. Something moved across Holt's face. It was not surprise. Is that right? Identification. Evelyn reached toward the inside pocket of her coat. His hand came up instantly. Slow. She stopped and held very still. My identification is in my jacket. 2 fingers. She looked directly at him. Sheriff Holt, I'd like to take the temperature of this conversation down about 40 degrees. And I'd like you to follow instructions. Evelyn used 2 fingers to draw out a leather credential wallet and handed it through the window. Holt tilted it under the light. White House, Executive Office of the President. Carter, Evelyn Marie. His eyes went from the credential to her face, then back again. This supposed to impress me. It's supposed to identify me. He turned it over in his fingers. You know how many federal badges people buy off the internet. That isn't a badge. Call it whatever you want. And there it was, something old and familiar settling into Evelyn's chest. Not fear, recognition. She had been 24 the first time a courthouse deputy assumed she was the defendant instead of the attorney. 46. When a senator she had briefed 3 times asked whether she was with the catering company. 57, when a newly confirmed agency director walked past her into a White House conference room and asked her deputy when Ms. Carter would be arriving. Different rooms, different decades, the same half-second pause behind the eyes. You cannot be who you say you are. Evelyn had spent her whole life watching for that pause. By 60, she could hear it coming before anybody said a word. Holt handed the credential back. Step out of the car. No. His jaw tightened. That was not a request. I have given you federal identification. Your airport is operating under an emergency order that names me. There is a verification number printed on the back of that credential. Call it. I don't make phone calls because a stranger hands me a number. Then go through your own dispatch to the Federal Operations Center. I decide what needs verifying in my county. There it was. Evelyn looked past him toward the dark runway. Sheriff, this stopped being a county matter before I got here. Holt smiled. It was not a warm smile. You people come down here from Atlanta or Washington and figure saying the word. Federal. Means everybody's supposed to get out of your way. Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly. You people. He heard it a half-second too late. You know what I meant. I'd like to hear you say it. I meant government people. Then say, government people. He shifted his weight. The conversation had gotten away from him into territory he had not planned on entering, and instead of stepping back, he pushed forward. Step out of the vehicle. Evelyn opened the door. Not because he had won. Because the clock read 10:14, and every minute behind that gate was a minute the President of the United States would spend waiting on a runway in the rain. She stepped out into the weather. Holt looked her over. Dark trousers. Low, sensible shoes. A long charcoal coat soaked through at the shoulders. No detail. No driver. No entourage. He expected important people to arrive surrounded by proof of their own importance. She had none. and that seemed to settle something for him. Holt's face closed up. I don't care what color you are. Evelyn had not said one word about color. That was the moment she knew for certain. People almost never defend themselves against an accusation nobody has made, unless they have already heard it, quietly, somewhere inside their own head. Take me to Miss Jennings. Careful, this is still my county. And that, she said, is still the problem. She would think about that exchange later, on the airplane, and wish she had left the last line alone. Not because it was untrue, because it was the one sentence she said that night to win rather than to fix, and she had spent 30 years teaching younger people not to do that. Behind the terminal glass, Mara Jennings had been watching with a printout in her hand. A second message had come through 4 minutes earlier. Principal Carter Eta, immediate. Provide uninterrupted access. She keyed her radio. Sheriff? Holt answered without looking away. Busy. I need you inside. 5 minutes. We may not have 5 minutes. He turned the radio down. Evelyn had heard every word. So did I. Did what? Tell you we don't have 5 minutes. Something in Holt broke loose then. He reached for her arm. Evelyn pulled it back the way a person pulls a hand off a hot stove, without deciding to. His whole posture changed. Do not resist me. I am not resisting you. Do not put your hands on me. You are being detained. On what grounds? Attempted unauthorized entry to a restricted facility, possible fraudulent federal identification, refusal to comply with lawful instruction. Evelyn looked at him a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was almost gentle. You need to be very certain. I am. No, Sheriff. You're angry. Turn around. Daniel. He blinked. She had read his nameplate at some point, and something about hearing his first name in that steady, unhurried voice unsettled him more than anything else she had said. Don't. You are standing at the edge of a decision you are going to remember for the rest of your life. Turn around. Evelyn breathed out. Then she turned around. Deputy Lucas Reed had pulled in less than a minute before. He was 28, had served under Daniel Holt for 5 years, and had admired the man for most of them. Holt promoted him after he pulled a family out of a wrecked minivan on the county line. Holt came to his mother's funeral in dress uniform, stood in the back, and never said a word until it was over. But Lucas had also seen a few things in 5 years he had never known what to do with. A stop where a black college student got searched because, in Holt's words, the kid looked too nervous. A complaint from a business owner on Route 12 that quietly went away after Holt called it a misunderstanding. A joke in the break room he had pretended not to hear and gone on pretending not to hear for 2 years. Small things. Every one of them small enough to excuse by itself. Tonight, watching his sheriff handcuff a 60-year-old woman who had produced White House credentials while the airport manager stood at the door practically begging him to come inside, those small things began to line up and make a shape. Sheriff, Lucas said, maybe we run the credential first. You questioning me? No, sir. Then secure the vehicle. Lucas didn't move. Evelyn turned her head slightly, and their eyes met. She saw a young man realizing, in real time, that he was going to have to choose. Deputy, what's your name? Ma'am, don't talk to him, Holt said. Lucas answered anyway. Reed, Lucas Reed. Deputy Reed. There is a verification number on the back of my credential. Call it from a department line. Not mine, yours. Holt clicked the second cuff closed. It was 10:23. That's enough. Lucas looked at his sheriff, then at the woman in the rain. I can make the call, sir. You can secure the vehicle. Sheriff, now. Lucas obeyed, but he did it slowly, and he did not turn off his body camera. Neither did Holt, because 7 years earlier Daniel Holt had campaigned on those cameras, chased the grant money for 2 years, and written the activation policy in his own hand. Every citizen contact, no exceptions, no discretion. He had stood on the courthouse steps and called it the best money the county ever spent. Mara Jennings stopped waiting. She came out the side door with the printout held over her head. "Sheriff Holt." He turned. "I have confirmation." "Mara, go inside." "No, read it. The Federal Operations Center confirms Evelyn Carter is the named principal." Holt glanced at the woman in cuffs, then back. "Anybody can send an email." "It came through the emergency aviation system. Systems get hacked. There's a national systems incident tonight. You know that better than I do." Standing in the rain with her hands behind her, Evelyn found herself almost admiring the machinery of it. Every new fact that should have moved him toward the truth was being converted, instantly, into one more reason to distrust the source. He was not weighing evidence anymore. He was defending a conclusion. Mara stepped closer and dropped her voice. "What if you're wrong?" Holt looked at Evelyn. He had reached the point where admitting uncertainty felt more dangerous than being wrong. "I'm not." "That sentence," Evelyn said quietly, "has ended more careers than any insult ever has." He ignored her. "Take her inside." Lucas straightened up. "Inside where?" "Interview room." Mara stared. "We don't have an interview room." "The conference office." "You are not turning my terminal into a holding cell." "I can during a security incident." "This is not a security incident." Holt looked at the woman in handcuffs. "Maybe it is." That was when the runway came on. The lights flickered once, twice. Then 8,000 feet of black pavement turned into a long, glowing corridor, running out into the rain. White edge lights, green threshold lights, red beacons blinking away at the far end of the field. Everybody turned to look. Holt grabbed for the radio. "Shut it down." Mara took a step back. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." "It was activated under a federal order. You don't have a confirmed aircraft." "Actually," said a voice from the doorway, "we do. I just took priority routing notification from Atlanta Center." "For what aircraft?" He looked at Evelyn, then at Holt. "They won't release the call sign on the local frequency yet." Holt made a sound that was almost a laugh. "How convenient." Ben ignored him completely. "But the authentication block is presidential support." Nobody said anything. Lucas stopped where he stood. Holt's expression barely moved. Presidential support could mean a lot of things. Ben stared at him like a man watching somebody walk toward the edge of a roof. Not tonight, it couldn't. Evelyn checked her watch. 10:26. "Mr. Walsh, is your secure line operational?" "Yes, ma'am." "White House Operations is going to call it." Holt scoffed. "They tell you that?" "No." "Then how do you know?" Evelyn turned to face him fully, water running off her chin. "Because I wrote the emergency communications protocol you are currently standing here ignoring." For the first time, Lucas saw real doubt move across Daniel Holt's face. It lasted about a second and a half. Then the red phone rang. Not the terminal line, not Mara's office phone. The encrypted handset bolted to the wall inside the control room, the one tested twice a year for 9 years that had never once carried a live call. It rang again. Mara picked it up. "Mercer County Regional, Secure Operations. Sir, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it clearly. Miss Carter is not on the airfield. She is standing in my control room. She is in handcuffs." The sheriff detained her at the gate. Holt's head came around sharply. Mara listened for 4 full seconds. Then she closed her eyes. "Yes, sir. I'll tell him." She lowered the receiver and covered it, and when she turned around, her face had gone the color of paper. "What?" Holt demanded. "The White House military office wants to know why the president's chief of staff is wearing your handcuffs." Nobody said anything. Rain ticked against the windows. Somewhere west of the field, thunder rolled and died out. Holt reached for his handcuff key, and Evelyn stepped back. He froze. "What?" "You were certain enough to put them on." Her voice was perfectly level. You can be patient enough to take them off in front of the same people who watched you decide I was a liar." Holt looked around the room. Mara, Ben, Lucas. Cal Prine had come up through the maintenance corridor with a wrench still in his hand. 2 line attendants stood beyond the glass. His face went red. He unlocked the cuffs. The metal came away, and there were red marks on both of Evelyn's wrists where she had stood in the cold rain with her hands pulled back for 11 minutes. Lucas saw them. So did Mara. So did Cal. Evelyn rubbed one wrist once. Just once. Then she put out her hand for the phone. "This is Carter." The room went absolutely still. "Yes, I'm fine. No medical issue. No, I don't need it logged that way." A pause, and she looked up at the ceiling, the way people do when they are listening hard. "Understood. Continue as planned." She listened a moment longer. "Tell the president I'll be on the ramp in 10 minutes. She hung up. Holt found his voice. "Continue what as planned." Evelyn picked her credential up off the counter and slid it back into her coat. "You don't have clearance for that information." It was not said cruelly. It was not said loudly. It simply closed a door, and everyone in the room heard it close. Holt seemed to remember all at once that he was still wearing a badge. "Hold on. Nobody puts a presidential aircraft on this field without coordination with my department. Your department was part of the coordination. I was not informed. You were told exactly what you needed to know to do your job." Her eyes stayed on his. "You decided the message was less credible than your impression of me. That's not what happened." "Then tell me what happened." Holt glanced at the others, and something in him hardened rather than yielded. "You showed up alone, at night, in the middle of a national systems incident, claiming to be White House staff. Your airport manager confirmed my authorization in writing. Your controller confirmed presidential routing. The secure line confirmed me. That last one happened afterward." Evelyn nodded slowly. "Yes, it did. After you had already turned down 3 separate chances to verify me. One of them from your own deputy." His face tightened. "So I'm supposed to let anybody through that gate who says they're important?" "No." Evelyn took one step toward him. "I expect you to know the difference between caution and contempt. Caution asks questions. You didn't ask one question you were willing to hear the answer to. I never said anything racial." "No, you were more careful than that." His eyes came up. "I have black deputies." Lucas dropped his gaze to the floor. Evelyn had heard that sentence in 100 forms from 100 people, and something in her went tired. "And what does that fact tell you about tonight?" "It tells you I'm not what you're implying." "I haven't implied anything." "You're turning this into race." "No, Sheriff." She shook her head once. "Race was already here." The room got very quiet. It was here when you looked at a federal credential and decided the woman holding it was more likely to be a criminal than the person whose name is printed on it. It was here when Mara confirmed my authorization and you decided the system might be lying. It was here when Deputy Reed offered to make one telephone call and you shut him down. It was here in the fact that every piece of evidence tonight had to climb uphill against a conclusion you reached in the first 10 seconds. Holt's jaw was set. "You don't know me." "You're right." "I don't." Evelyn looked down at the red marks on her wrists. "I only know what you did when you thought I had nobody to call." Nobody in that room moved. That sentence would appear in newspapers within 36 hours. It would be read aloud in a state hearing room 4 months later. It would be printed on hand-lettered signs outside the county courthouse. But in that moment, it belonged to 7 people standing in a control room at a wet county airport in Georgia. Holt opened his mouth, and a low sound interrupted him. At first, it sounded like more thunder. Then it deepened, and kept deepening, and it did not stop. Ben pulled his headset back on. "Aircraft 6 miles out." Mara stared into the rain. "Which aircraft?" Ben listened. Then he pushed one ear cup back, and his voice came out barely above a whisper. "Special Air Mission." Evelyn walked toward the door. Holt went after her. "Ms. Carter." She stopped. He had finally stopped calling her ma'am, and both of them noticed. "I made a judgment call." "Yes. I was trying to protect this airport." "Yes. I had no way of knowing." She turned around. "That is the only part of tonight you still don't understand." Behind her, the runway lights ran out into the dark and doubled themselves in the wet pavement. "You had several ways of knowing. You chose not to use any of them." She opened the door and walked out into the rain. Emergency vehicles lined the ramp with their lights turning. Airport workers stood under the awning in a silent row. The aircraft came down out of the low cloud like a white shape being drawn out of the dark, landing lights burning through the rain. Holt had seen Air Force One on television his entire life, behind presidents and beneath flags. On television, it looked like a symbol. There was nothing symbolic about it in person. The wheels struck the pavement and threw up two long walls of mist. The engines roared into reverse. The airplane slowed and finally turned, and the blue and white fuselage came taxiing back through the weather with United States of America stretched down the length of it. Daniel Holt felt something inside himself give way. Not because Evelyn Carter turned out to be important. Because she had been telling him the truth from the first word out of her mouth. Every single thing she said had been true, and he had needed an airplane big enough to carry the President of the United States before he was willing to believe her. 20 feet away, Lucas Reed arrived at exactly the same thought. Air stairs came down. Agents moved first, then military personnel, then a tall man in a dark overcoat crossed the wet concrete toward Evelyn. Holt recognized him from television. Thomas Vale, the National Security Advisor of the United States. The first thing Vale did was look at her wrists. "What happened?" "Later." He followed her eyes toward the terminal. His expression changed. "That him?" "Thomas." One word. "A warning." Vale nodded once. "President's waiting." Evelyn started toward the stairs. Then she stopped and turned back. "Deputy Reed, come here." He came. Holt watched him do it. Evelyn put a plain card in his hand. "That's my office. Somebody answers it at any hour. If anyone asks what happened here tonight, and they will, tell them the truth." Holt's face changed. "Miss Carter, is that really necessary?" Evelyn did not look at him. "Not my version," she said to Lucas. Then she did look at Holt. "Not his version." Back to Lucas. "Yours." "Yes, ma'am." Evelyn Carter climbed the stairs without hurrying. Nobody saluted. No music played. No crowd applauded. She went up like a woman coming in out of the rain, and the door closed behind her. 23 minutes later, the airplane lifted off and disappeared into the weather. The storm stayed, and Daniel Holt stood underneath it with the growing understanding that the most dangerous part of his night had not happened yet. Aboard the aircraft, 40 minutes east, Evelyn sat at the conference table with a cup of coffee she had not touched. President Helen Ward came in without ceremony and sat down across from her. At 63, Ward had silver hair, tired eyes, and a lifelong habit of reading a room before she said anything in it. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." Ward looked at her wrists. "You're not fine. They'll heal." "I wasn't talking about your wrists." Evelyn set the cup down. "Tell me about the incident first." Ward gave her the short version. Not a military strike, a coordinated intrusion against 4 private contractors, riding in on a maintenance update that 11 systems had trusted because they had always trusted it. Containment was underway. Nobody had died. And the federal networks? Held. Every one of them. The emergency aviation system, the operations center, the secure line at that airport, all of it worked exactly the way it was built to work. Evelyn let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "He told me the systems might be compromised. They were the only things in Mercer County last night that weren't." Ward let that sit. Then, "You want to know why I put the airplane down there? I assumed it was the command site timing. That would have held another 2 hours. The president turned her cup a quarter turn on the table. I diverted because I wanted you in the room before I sat down with the chiefs, and I decided that was worth bending an entire air operation around. Which means a sheriff put handcuffs on you at 10:23, and by 10:45, the largest airplane in the federal government was on his runway. For you. Does that make you feel better or worse? Evelyn was quiet a moment. Worse. Because that is exactly what almost nobody gets. What do you want me to do? Nothing. If you make this presidential, he becomes a martyr to every person in this country looking for one. She shook her head. Let the system he says he believes in take a look at him. That's all. Ward studied her. You think this is bigger than you? I know it is. People don't turn into somebody else the minute they meet a powerful person. If he treated me like that when he thought I was nobody, then I want to know how he has been treating people who actually had nobody to call. The president was quiet for a while. All right? Evelyn picked up her coffee and set it down again. One more thing, and I'd rather you hear it from me. At the gate, he told me it was still his county, and I told him that was the problem. Ward raised an eyebrow. It was. It was also the only sentence I set out there to win instead of to fix. I've been telling 28-year-olds not to do that for a decade. She almost smiled. 60 years old, standing in the rain, and I still wanted the last word. Evelyn, you were in handcuffs. I know. It still counts. By sunrise, the video was in Washington. Daniel Holt's own camera had run for 38 minutes. It recorded him examining a White House credential and handing it back. It recorded him refusing 3 offers of verification. It recorded the click of the cuffs. And near the beginning, standing at the gate with the rain coming down, it recorded him saying, "You people come down here from Atlanta or Washington and figure saying the word federal means everybody's supposed to get out of your way." That sentence would be replayed more than anything else in the file. Holt insisted, then and afterward, that he meant government people. It is possible that he did. But context has a cruel way of outliving intention. At 6:40 that morning, his county attorney called him at home. Daniel, do not talk to the press. The governor's office called the commission chairman an hour ago. They're preserving all the airport footage. Holt sat down slowly at his own kitchen table. For what? An investigation. Did you? The attorney said. Because I've watched your camera twice this morning, and you're going to need a lawyer who isn't me. At 7:12, Lucas Reed's phone rang with a Washington number. He almost let it go to voicemail. Then he remembered the card in his shirt pocket. A woman introduced herself as counsel to the White House Chief of Staff. Ms. Carter asked us to get your account before anyone has a chance to encourage you to adjust it. Lucas thought about the sheriff telling him 3 separate times that morning, too. Remember the security context. He thought about the chief deputy saying, twice, that everybody needed to stay on the same page. Same page. He had heard that phrase his whole career, and it had always sounded like teamwork. That morning, it sounded like an instruction. What happens if I tell you everything? That depends on what everything is. Can I call you back? Yes. Whenever you've decided which part of your career you want to be able to live with. Lucas sat by himself for 9 minutes. Then he called back. By noon it had leaked. Not from Evelyn, and not from the White House, but from a line attendant who filmed the landing from inside a fuel truck and sent it to his brother in Savannah. The brother posted it with one line of text. Air Force One landed in Bellwether last night, and our sheriff had the president's chief of staff in cuffs. The department issued a statement that afternoon, and Daniel Holt approved every word of it. Officers followed standard security procedures until identity could be conclusively established. The Mercer County Sheriff's Office does not discriminate and remains committed to the safety of all citizens. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation opened its file on the airport. Within 48 hours, the file had outgrown the airport. A middle school teacher named Denise Porter was pulled over 3 times in 5 weeks after she bought a used Lexus, and never once received a citation. A contractor named Malik Howard produced dash video of deputies searching his work truck without consent after he asked, politely, why he had been stopped. A retired Army sergeant named Clarence Boone said Holt personally detained him outside a hunting supply store because a customer called in a suspicious man with a rifle. Boone owned the rifle legally. It was in a locked case. He had served 26 years. Prejudice almost never shows up carrying a sign. It lives in accumulated seconds. Who gets asked for identification? Who gets believed the first time? Who gets the benefit of the doubt? Who gets called sir? Who gets a warning? And who gets handcuffs? Any one of those seconds can be explained away. All of them together make a pattern. And once a pattern becomes visible, it is very hard to stop seeing it. There was no single explosive document. No secret order, no recording of a slur. There was something more ordinary than that, and therefore harder to fix. There was a culture. Holt had built a department around his own instincts, and his deputies had learned what made him suspicious, whose word he took, which complaints were serious, and which were a misunderstanding. Nobody ever had to write it down. They had simply watched him. 3 weeks in, Holt called Lucas into his office and told him to close the door. "You're talking to the state." "Yes, sir." Holt looked at him a long time. "I helped you. Your mother got sick. I gave you leave. Nobody else in that building would have approved. I stood in the back of that church. I know. And this is how you pay me back. This isn't about paying you back." "Then what is it about?" "The truth." Holt's face changed. "You think I'm a racist?" Lucas looked at the floor, and the silence answered more completely than any sentence could have. "Look at me. Look at me. I asked you a question." Lucas looked at him. "I think sometimes you decide who a person is too fast. Everybody does that." "Maybe. Probably." Lucas took a breath. "But most people aren't wearing a badge when they do it." Holt stared at him, and Lucas saw something he had not been braced for. Not rage, hurt. It would have been easier if Daniel Holt had been cruel every day. Easier if bad men wore it openly, like a coat. But Holt had coached Little League for 11 years, raised money for a deputy's wife's cancer treatment, driven elderly people home in an ice storm in his own truck, and sat in a hospital waiting room at 2 in the morning with a 26-year-old whose mother was dying. A man can do all of that and still carry something harmful inside him. That was the truth Lucas had been avoiding for 5 years, because it was inconvenient. People want character to be simple. Good man, bad man, hero, villain. Reality almost never cooperates. "I loved working for you," Lucas said. Past tense? "I don't know yet." Holt turned toward the window. "Get out." Evelyn did not go back to Mercer County. Not until Lorraine Bell called her in February. "There's something of Daddy's you ought to see." The old high school was a community center now, but Samuel Bell's chalkboard was still on the wall of the history classroom, and above it hung 2 rows of photographs of former students, doctors, teachers, mechanics, soldiers, nurses, and one 17-year-old girl with a round face and serious eyes. I'd forgotten how angry I looked. Lorraine handed her a sealed envelope. "He wrote this last spring. He just said I'd know who it was for." The handwriting shook more than it used to. "Evelyn, you have spent your life walking into rooms that were not built for you, and you got very good at it. I am still proud of that. But I have started to worry that I taught you only the first half. Getting inside is not the finish line. A degree, a title, an office, those things can buy you a hearing. They cannot buy anybody else one. A country can learn to make room for a handful of people it finds impressive without ever changing what it assumes about everybody else. So here is the second half, and I am sorry I waited so long to write it down. Ask yourself, what happens to the people who will never have a title to show anyone? That is where the real work is. Evelyn read the last two lines twice. Her mother, Ruth Carter, had worked 34 years as a nursing assistant at a hospital in Macon. No Yale degree, no credential in a leather wallet, no agents at the end of the hallway. When Evelyn was 14, Ruth came home from a night shift 2 hours late, and Evelyn heard her tell her father in the kitchen that an officer had pulled her over 4 blocks from the house and made her empty her purse onto the hood of the car because he did not believe the hospital parking pass hanging from her mirror belonged to her. Ruth never filed a complaint. She had 3 children asleep in the house and a shift starting again in 9 hours. She gathered her things off the hood and she drove home. Evelyn sat down at Samuel Bell's old desk and cried. Not loudly, not for long, but enough. 2 days later, she agreed to testify before the Georgia Public Safety Commission. The hearing was broadcast statewide. Daniel Holt sat behind his attorney in a suit that had gotten loose on him. The chairman asked why she had initially declined to file a personal complaint. Because I had access to extraordinary protection. Evelyn adjusted the microphone. I can call the White House at 2 in the morning and somebody answers. I can have federal counsel on the phone before breakfast. And I'd ask the commission to sit with this one, have a presidential aircraft come down on a county runway in a thunderstorm. She paused. Most people stopped on a dark road in Mercer County have none of that. What happened to me after Sheriff Holt found out who I was is not the part that concerns me. What concerns me is what would have happened if he never found out at all. Do you believe race influenced his conduct? Yes. A commissioner leaned in. Did he use a racial slur? Did he ever say he doubted you because you are black? No, neither. Then what supports your conclusion? Evelyn looked over at Holt for the first time. Pattern. Bias does not usually announce itself. Most of the time it shows up as a different standard of proof. She set a copy of her credential on the table. One person presents identification and is presumed to be telling the truth unless something suggests otherwise. Another presents identification and is presumed to be lying until the evidence becomes overwhelming. Same document, same building, same night. The distance between those two assumptions is not an opinion. In my case, it turned out to be 11 minutes and a pair of handcuffs. Ms. Carter, do you believe Sheriff Holt is a bad man? Evelyn considered it longer than anyone expected. No. The answer moved through the room like a change in the weather. Even Holt looked up. I think that question is too easy. Bad men are convenient. They let the rest of us off the hook. If prejudice only lived in bad men, all any of us would have to do is not be one. She shook her head slowly. Sometimes it looks respectable. Sometimes it has served a community faithfully for 20 years. Sometimes it coaches Little League and visits the sick and means every word of it. That is exactly why it survives so long. She turned back to the commissioners. The question in front of you is not whether Daniel Holt has ever done a good thing. I'm certain he has done a great many. The question is whether the authority this state handed him was used the same way on every road in that county. The hearing ran 5 hours. At the end of it, Holt did the one thing his attorney had spent 4 months begging him not to do. He asked to speak. He walked to the witness table and sat down, and he had no notes. I've spent 4 months telling myself I did nothing wrong. His attorney closed his eyes. I told myself I'd have treated anybody the same. He looked across the room at Evelyn. The problem is, I've run out of ways to believe that. The room went perfectly still. When Mara Jennings put a confirmed federal order in my hand, I still didn't believe it. When my own deputy, a boy I trained, asked me to make one phone call, I got angry at him for asking. When the controller told me the routing block said presidential support, I told him the system might be lying. And when that red phone rang, I was still looking for one more reason. His voice was thinning out. I needed to see the airplane. Nobody in the room was breathing normally. I needed to see Air Force One come down on my runway before I could look at that woman and accept that she was exactly who she'd been telling me she was for 15 minutes straight. He turned his hands over on the table. I don't know what else to call that. I've had 4 months and I have not come up with another name for it. Evelyn watched him. There was no triumph anywhere in her face. Holt looked back at Lucas, 6 rows behind him. I've hurt people. Maybe not because I woke up wanting to. He paused. I used to think that was the important part. I don't think that anymore. Then he turned in his chair to face her directly. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I put those handcuffs on you. No cameras clicked. They were already recording. Nobody applauded, which was the only thing that could have ruined it. Evelyn answered quietly, I believe you. Relief moved across his face. Then she added, but an apology to me is the easiest one you'll ever have to make. You owe answers to people who never had an airplane coming down the runway. His eyes dropped to the table. Yes, ma'am. This time, when he said ma'am, it landed differently. Everyone in the room heard it. Daniel Holt resigned 2 weeks later. He was not ordered to. The commission had not finished its work. He submitted 3 paragraphs, and the operative sentence read, I cannot lead a department while continuing to describe its culture as somebody else is doing. In the spring, the county commission named Lucas Reed interim sheriff, 4 votes to 3. He was 29, with 5.5 years on the job, and plenty of people in Mercer County said out loud that it was a mistake. Privately, Lucas agreed he had been handed something before he was ready for it. He did the work anyway. His first policy required a documented supervisory review anytime a deputy rejected identification as fraudulent during a detention. His second created a complaint system outside the chain of command. His third took the most explaining at the budget meeting. Twice a year, every deputy attends a community meeting out of uniform. Not to speak, not to recruit. They sit down and they listen. At the first one, Clarence Boone stood up in the back, 71 years old, standing the way men stand when they have spent 26 years standing that way, and told the room about the rifle case. Lucas had read the report 3 times. Hearing it out of Boone's own mouth was not the same thing at all. I carried a weapon on 3 continents for this country, Boone said, and the most nervous I have ever been carrying one was walking it past your deputies in a locked case in my own hometown. Lucas had come in planning to defend the department, and somewhere in the middle of that sentence he decided not to. I'm sorry, sir. Boone looked at him a moment. Don't be sorry, son. He nodded toward the deputies along the wall in their street clothes. Be different. A year after the airport, Mercer County Regional held its annual air show. Mara Jennings invited Evelyn Carter. Evelyn declined twice. The third invitation came with a note in Mara's handwriting. You don't have to come as chief of staff. Come as the woman we should have opened the gate for. She went. No presidential aircraft. No motorcade the public could see. No national press. She arrived in a plain black SUV a little before noon on a clear Saturday in October, and when she reached the access gate, it rolled open before she had come to a stop. Mara was waiting on the other side of it. Well, better service? Evelyn smiled. Marginally. They both laughed, and it was the first easy sound either of them had made about that night. Lucas Reed came across the ramp in civilian clothes. Second hangar, he said, when she asked. He volunteers with the Aviation Museum now, restores old radios. Inside the second hangar, at a workbench under a hanging lamp, Daniel Holt was reassembling a communications set out of a 1960s transport plane. His hair had gone gray at the temples. He had lost weight he did not have to lose. He saw her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then he wiped his hands on a shop cloth. Ms. Carter? Daniel. He nodded down at the radio. Turns out I'm better at listening when the equipment is older than I am. Evelyn's eyebrows went up. I believe that's the first joke I've ever heard you make. I had a rough year. He turned the cloth over in his hands. I went back through every complaint I signed off on, 17 years of them. Some I still think were handled right. Some weren't. I went and met with people. How many? 37. 9 wouldn't see me. That was their right. I know it was. He looked out at the field. It didn't help, if that's what you were going to ask. I wasn't. It wasn't supposed to help. Took me a while to work that out. That pleased her more than she expected. I still run that night back, he said. I keep landing on the same thing you told me. That you only knew what I did when I thought you had nobody to call. He was quiet a moment. Because I know exactly what I did after I found out who you were. I got scared. I respected you the second I learned your title. And that wasn't respect. That was fear of consequences. He shook his head slowly. I should have respected you before I knew one single thing about you. That's the whole job. That was always the whole job. For the first time since they had met, Evelyn put out her hand. Daniel Holt looked at it. Then he shook it. Not forgiveness. Not absolution. Something smaller than either one, and probably more useful than both. Late that afternoon, Evelyn stood beside Mara, near the same gate where all of it had started. Children were pressed against the fence, watching a line of vintage aircraft taxi past. Does it ever get easier? Mara asked. Being the person in the room, everybody underestimates. No, but you learn that their disbelief is information. It tells you something true about the room, before the room knows anything about you. The loudspeaker announced the final flyover, and every face on the field turned upward. Evelyn did not. She looked at the gate instead. It was nothing. A frame of galvanized pipe and chain link on a rolling track. The kind of thing you could order out of a catalog for $800. A year earlier, a man had stood on one side of it, certain that the badge on his shirt gave him the authority to decide who belonged on the other. Samuel Bell had told her to keep the door open for somebody who had never been invited inside, and she had spent 40 years believing she understood him. She had only understood the first half. It is not enough to open a door once you discover that the person outside turns out to be important. That is not justice. That is arithmetic. Justice is how you treat the person whose name means nothing to you at all. The woman driving home from a night shift with a hospital pass on her mirror. The father reaching slowly toward his glove compartment. The old soldier carrying a locked rifle case across a parking lot in his own hometown. The stranger standing at a gate in the rain, saying quietly that she belongs there. Evelyn looked down at her wrist. The marks had faded within a week. The memory had not, and she was glad of it. Some things are not supposed to fade. Above Mercer County, 4 aircraft came over the field in formation, and 1,000 people looked up. Daniel Holt stood in the hangar doorway with a shop cloth in his hand. Lucas Reed stood among his deputies in a plain shirt. Mara Jennings stood next to Evelyn Carter at the gate. And for a few seconds, all of them were looking at the same sky.